Yeah. Hello, Chuck. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm absolutely thrilled that you accepted my invitation, and I would love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, hi, Jackie. Thank you for having me on. This is really exciting. It's great to connect more and more with the network around because I'm finding the more I put myself out there, the more I'm able to meet really cool people. So this is really exciting to get to talk to you one on one as opposed to a Facebook message.
Awesome. Yeah, agreed.
So I'm a psychotherapist in Kempville. I work with the Kempville Stress Relief Center. I'm also the COO there, so I take care of a lot of well, I dabble in a little bit of everything, which we'll see coming out with workshops and courses and things like that. I also have a podcast called Couch to Couch, Making Therapy Make Sense with Chuck LeBlanc, where I interview random therapists from all over Canada and hopefully into the States a little bit later on in October. Basically, just helping make therapy more accessible by giving people more to think about because it can be really daunting to call a therapist in the first place, let alone try to research the right therapist for you if you don't know a lot about the lingo. So basically, I like to shoot the shit with other therapists and try to figure out what way we can make it more accessible.
Love. That's
And
really amazing.
oh, thanks. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And so as a therapist, I deal primarily with males, people who identify as male, and male vulnerability, which comes up in many different ways. Things like social anxiety, anxiety itself, depression, and stuff like that.
I so appreciate that. And you are my number one referral for anyone who is a man or identifies as a man and wants to work with a man.
Oh,
Because as
thank
you
you.
know, or maybe you don't know, but I work primarily with women and mothers, but I do also work with men if I work with everybody, but if they want a man, then I send them to you. And so I'm really appreciative of having you and your services in this region and just like in general, because I feel safe, right, sending men your way because I really align with your sort of philosophical approach, I think, and theoretical approach, right, to treatment or to engagement, right, in this sort of
Mm.
therapeutic relationship. So I
Oh, thank you very
appreciate.
much.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure, and I'm really glad that you're here. So I want to talk a little bit more about what you said in terms of male vulnerability. So will you
Mm.
talk to me about that and sort of how it comes up in your practice?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the reasons I became a counselor was my own personal journey with male vulnerability, which had a hilarious twist when I started being a counselor. But so I grew up in like well, I socialized like a typical male in the John Wayne mentality, I call it. Toughen up and suck it up. So you're not really allowed to cry. And when you do it on your own. So it's very isolating,
Mm.
which does lead, and we know, and we can dive into this if we want, but we do know that isolation when it comes to emotional repression, specifically grief or sadness, is a downward spiral into depression. Because, from a narrative therapy perspective, depression wants isolation. So the more you isolate, the closer you invite it into your life. Um, and so I spent a long time in that world. And in my 20s, I suffered from a pretty extreme depression after the loss of a best friend from suicide. And that was one of the darkest times in my life. And part of the reason was because I wasn't reaching out at all. I felt like I had to take it on my own. And I know you and I have talked about Foucault a little bit, but the proof is in the pudding with the way I acted. And I remember I shut myself in my dorm for about a month, didn't really leave it, only ate, and did my sometimes would show up to class. I was in my master's at the time. And then one day I said, screw it, I'm throwing it all out. I don't want to talk to anybody. So I got a job at Home Depot, an overnight job. So that could be as isolated as humanly possible because I didn't want to deal with any of it. And I stopped going to class. And over time, I was able to pull myself out of that. But the hole that I had dug myself was specifically the embarrassment that came from having to talk about it. Because I knew I was so upset that I was going to cry in front of people and have to grieve with someone. And so, after a little bit of therapy and learning a little bit more to not only be in touch with the feelings but recognize them as emotions are the radar we use to encounter the world. They're our feedback system. So it's really important as a social creature to make sure that you're getting that feedback from other people because you can't do it in a vacuum, I started to do more research on vulnerability. Brene Brown was a big inspiration for me on that. But I did do my original master's in capability theory, which is written by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. So it's a philosophic theory that basically talks about poverty in a very different way, but poverty as capability deprivation. So it's the things that happen, whether from societal influence in the case of male vulnerability, or internal in the case of weaponized shame, how we shame ourselves to stay still, that cuts off our capabilities to help us grow. So one capability in particular is play and socialization, the ability to meet people, interact with other people, learn from other people. Gets cut off pretty harshly in moments of grief like that with men because we can't reach out. So that's really what started me on the track to becoming a counselor way back 1.5 million years ago, before I actually jumped in 4 years ago to do the second master's.
That's awesome. So how did you take the step? How did you very practically decide to talk to someone?
Well, as is typical with my life, it happened in a very accidental, chaotic way. I was lying in my dorm after a night shift, and I was on my laptop, and I decided to watch a movie. So it was one of the first moments of entertainment I allowed to show up in this dark time. And the movie that showed up was Yes Man by Jim Carrey. And so I was watching, and Jim Carrey is one of my favorite comedians of all time. And I had a couple of chuckles through the movie, but when I left the movie, I was like, you know what? I've been in a depression like this before when I was 13, and I was suicidal myself back then. This is very scaring. This is scaringly close to how I felt back then, and that can't happen. That just can't happen at 25. And so I said, screw it, I'm going to say yes to whatever shows up. And then hopefully that'll get me out of my shell. And one of the first conversations I had with a prof who was a mentor of mine was, they hadn't seen me in a while, they were worried about it, and they asked me if I wanted to talk about it. And normally I'd be like, no, I'm good, and then I would just leave. And this time I was like, yes, let's just say something. And luckily the mentor at the time also was close with this. It was a former student of theirs, so they knew the whole story. And I basically just sat down in a chair and cried for an hour. Didn't really say much, but I let all the emotions I was bottling up for 2 months just flowed out of me. And that was one of the first moments where I said, okay, maybe there's something to this. Because prior to this, the only therapy I ever had was with a psychiatrist for ADHD for about 5 minutes for an assessment and a pill, basically. So prior to that, I didn't really heard about therapy. No one ever talked about it. I didn't know much about it. But the advice after that hour-long conversation was, call this number, see what happens. Just go for it. And I was like, okay, let's do it. So that was really the first step, was basically saying yes to it.
I love that. Yeah. It's amazing what can happen when you say yes.
Yeah. And it's not, it's one of the, I always carry this with me with every client, no matter who's coming in the door, is I have an utmost respect for the fact that they even called in the first place. Because it takes a lot of willpower and it takes a lot of guts and care for the self to make that call, let alone step into the room. Or now the COVID-19, pick up the phone, since I do everything over the phone now. But there's an intense amount of courage that goes into that demands respect.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, because I remember we have a very similar trajectory in terms of, feeling sort of suicidal at quite a young age, and then it's sort of manifesting in our masters. So we have a parallel journey.
Awesome.
And I remember feeling like, oh, this is it, this is the moment, I'm just crazy now, I can't stop crying, it's just over for me, and so it was sort of like that acceptance, being like, okay, so now I need to talk to somebody about it, but then sitting in someone's office and telling them oh, I'm crazy. You know what I mean?
Yep.
It was very, very difficult, and just I cried through my entire session, and and then, sort of peeling that apart, picking it apart, and being like, this isn't about being crazy. This is about, so much more than that,
Mm-hmm.
or so much different from that. So I appreciate you talking about the courage it takes, because a lot of us know we need to do something,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't, for whatever reason, and it's usually because of this shame, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're like, well, I'm just crazy. I mean,
That's right.
what am I
It
gonna
must
do?
be a me problem.
It's definitely a me problem.
Yeah, that's right.
So talk to me a little bit about shame and what you're calling weaponized shame.
Yeah, so this says, well, everything has a story, but we know that the piece of shame. So I deal with this in two ways. So this is a working hypothesis. So I'll need some help. But on one side, we know that shame is a moral emotion. So it's an emotion that we have to make sure that if we screw something up, like we say something, we're like, oh damn. It's this feeling we get to make sure that we rectify the behavior so that we can stay within the tribe, not get kicked out of the community. So it was developed evolutionarily to keep us jiving with the people around us. And so that part, it makes sense, part of the radar. But weaponized shame is something that I think happens when someone uses shame against you, so that you internalize it and then use it against yourself. So the first time I got this idea stemmed from Carl Rogers' his thoughts on interjection, where he talks about how the organism, the person, when we're born, we know kids are wild and crazy, and the reason they're wild and crazy is because they've never been here before, and they're literally in the process of making a person themselves. They're eating sand, they're looking at worms, and they're like, this is wild. And so then we'll come in and say, wait a minute, like, don't touch the stove. That's important. But if you, let's say, have a parent who's dealing with like extreme anxiety and can't handle when things get out of control, then they might step in and start to curb your behavior because they can't handle the situation, not because you're in danger. And so you run the risk of being like, oh, to be a good kid, I better be quiet. And you do that long enough, and then as an adult, you're like, wait, I better stay quiet to be accepted. And no one's telling you that anymore, but the shame has now been weaponized, because now you're using it as a weapon against yourself to stop you from coming out of your shell. And with male socialization, we see this all the time. The words men don't cry or tough it up is a way to shame someone into repressing their emotions, which, as we know as therapists, is like saying the fact that you have emotions is bad, morally wrong, because you're a man. And that's an inherent contradiction, because human beings have emotions that are designed specifically to be expressed. So now at 37, I'm sitting there going, I'm at a funeral and I really want to cry because it's really upsetting. And I'm like, no, I have to tough it up for the rest of my family. And there's times where it's called for that. That's okay. But if you're doing that just because you're embarrassed by the emotion, then that's the weaponized shame coming out, holding you back. And that's going to breed a whole bunch of other issues, like resentment and anger. Anger specifically in men, because we're socialized to have anger. We're allowed to express anger. That's it. So if all you're allowed is anger, you're not allowed the other emotions. Where the hell do you think everything else is going to show up as? Well, anger. So that's one aspect of weaponized shame, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. So it's very much about gender. It's about being appropriately male, in a variety of circumstances that call for emotion, but that disallow it.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nobody, and it's interesting because there's nobody there saying like, don't do it. But it's the Foucault, right? It's the dominant discourse itself. So everything around you is like, no, we can't. We're not allowed to do that. And then it's internalized to become a you problem. The fact that I'm sad is a problem. I'm weak. Which we know as organisms make no sense. So then there's going to be a feedback loop that's like, ugh, I'm frustrated. I need to cry. I need to do this. What the hell?
So what are some of the things that you tell men in order to be able to negotiate this in a more productive way than anger in their lives?
Well, the way I start from a foundational perspective, which means it's the use of self with me. So this comes with what I mentioned, I alluded to earlier, the interesting eye opener I had when I started. The first point of contact is me as the therapist creating that relationship and creating that space. So part of creating that space, if we're dealing with vulnerability, is I better be vulnerable straight away. So as a therapist, I'm very direct and very open, and I create a space where the male that I'm working with doesn't have to guess what I'm thinking. So for better or for worse, I say what I think. And part of that is also to express how I feel. And up until I became a therapist, I thought I was getting pretty good at the vulnerability thing until I sat in sessions with a client and realized how much work I really still had to do. And how many voices showed up and said, no, you can't do that. No, stop it. And I'm like, breathe and go, right? If we're talking about a grief conversation with a client, I'll now openly weep along with them if I'm feeling it. But before, there was like a moment of like, nope, okay, go, which is very strange in session. But so it starts with me being vulnerable so that they can count on it. And a lot of that is so they can experiment with it first. So it's one thing to say your emotions are designed to be expressed. Cry if you got to cry. Like that's just another shame thing, right? What's wrong with you? You're not crying. So on the other side, it's like, no, I will. You can watch me get impacted by your story and then decide if you're going to warm up to that sort of skill set. And then once you have, we'll go with some psychoeducation. So I'll teach you, this is how the brain works. These are what emotions are. And then we can kind of put them together. So I'll invite people in.
Okay. That sounds amazing. And so what do you think is super important for men to know, like in this moment, right? In this moment of sort of endless pandemic and, negotiating being with their families all of the time, or negotiating being isolated all of the time, or whatever it is. I mean, I know that we're coming out of that, perhaps soon to go back in.
Yeah, we never know.
Yeah, you never know. We got to ride that roller coaster. So what do you think? I guess what I'm asking is what is helpful in this moment for men in particular, especially men who are trapped in that sort of, anger, shame, lack of vulnerability cycle?
I think the first part about it is about radical acceptance. Accepting where you're at. It's a pandemic. It's been difficult. And it's been difficult for everyone, but each individual has their own circumstances which have added weight to how difficult that is, whether isolated or with your family. And radically accept those feelings that you're having. If you're angry, understand that you're angry. If you're sad, understand that you're sad. If you have difficult processing either of those, recognize that you have difficulty processing it. It's more productive to see things as they are than it is to have them and wonder what's wrong with you. Because at the end of the day, and this is true for, this might be controversial, but it's true for every emotion in my opinion, you have them for a reason. They're there for a purpose. And it's not that something's wrong with you. Michael White from narrative therapy has one of the best expressions of this. That is, I would probably get a tattoo of it on my forehead one day, where it says that you are not the problem is the problem. And so when you're coming in, regardless of what you're dealing with, it's not that here's one I hear a lot, I'm bad at grief, or I'm bad at being sad. It's not that you're bad at being sad. It's nothing to do with that. It's that there's a lot of external forces out there that are inviting you to stifle it. They're asking you to, but you don't want that to happen. So if you're a male who's isolated, one of the reasons that you end up having a lot of trouble or the depression gets deeper and deeper is because you're isolated. And that's the difficulty. So reaching out and building a social network as much as you can will help. And if you're in a situation where you have no social network, because that does happen, then reaching out to a therapist, someone you can talk to on a weekly basis. There's risk lines. There's places you can call where you can talk to a live human. There's places like Bumble BFF, I think it's called. There's another one which I love. And it's meeting people not for a dating purpose, for friendships. I met friends on there that I play board games with online when I'm isolated. or musicians will get together on it. It's just people who get together for a hobby and can meet. So there's all these little places to start shining the light of socialization into you. Because we're not, as humans, we're not designed to be isolated. So that's why we have a lot of trouble with it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then for men with their families, I mean, if I talk about my background, like a working class, I grew up in like a low income working class family. So my parents worked a lot. And I know that one of the running jokes with my parents now is that they don't have any kids in the house, so they have each other. So they had to relearn how to date after having 4 kids and working too much for 20 plus years. And now they're trying to, the first couple of years are rocky because you look at your partner and you're like, I have no idea who you are outside of being like the dad or the mom.
Mm-hmm.
And so then they have to relearn, go through that little bit of strife, and then start dating again and then work their way through it. And in the pandemic, that is forced on you. It's forced on you. So being irritated with your family, if I can go that far, is really normal right now. I know one of my friends who's a couples counselor was joking about it and just saying, you get married and you work, you raise kids, you're used to spending a certain amount of time together. But now in the pandemic, you're spending all of your time together. You didn't sign up for that. So we have to work our way through that.
Yeah, and especially juggling every role humanly possible within the confines of your home. Like, it's just bonkers.
That's right. It's, I don't have kids, and my heart goes out to those that do, because that is like that's a Herculean task to be able to manage all of that in any capacity, let alone a pandemic.
Yeah, and it's also really super unjust, right? To be like, you have to do all these things. Like, sorry.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we're like, well, we're seeing the face of it now, and we're living it. So I'm hoping for, on that note, like a wider conversation going forward. We'll see. Hopefully that'll happen. But the capitalist machine rages on. Topic of another podcast, but and then from like a male specific perspective, just on the socialization piece, part of our skill set that we're socialized into is to be like the provider, the fixer, the problem solver, which, counter to this, deals with a lot of male communication issues, but that's beside the point right now. But so in a pandemic, what do you think defense is going to go haywire in the middle of something as scary as a pandemic and a lockdown? Well, the provider and the fixer is just going to go nuts. That part of us and there's a lot that we can't. So anxiety is like basically the next door neighbor from that, because there's a lot you can't go out there and have a cure for COVID-19 and make sure everybody has enough money and go as one person. But your brain is going to think you can.
Yeah, and I just kind of, as we wrap up, I really wanted to pick up on this idea that you said I'm bad at grief, and this is something that's really sort of reflective of the conversations that I have with my clients. It's sort of like we don't necessarily know how to be in every given situation. Do you know what I mean? It's like It's like we think that feelings, emotions are natural, and so we should know how to perform them in every given situation. They should just come naturally, and then they should be in alignment with what's going on, right? It's like you shouldn't laugh at a funeral kind of thing, but the reality is, just like you were saying about the couple who has to get to know each other again, it's like we do have to kind of come to understand how we cope with things, or how we react to things, or how we manage things. So many women that I talk to, they're just like, I'm so angry. And it's like, yeah, you're really angry. And that makes total sense, because you've been handed a shit plate and you're supposed to smile about it. And that sucks, right? Like that feels like gaslighting. That feels like, bizarro world, like you're supposed to enjoy this like crazy sort of circumstance that you're given. Pandemic aside, just like when they hand you the baby kind of thing. So
here's the baby, here's the manual, good luck.
Yeah, it's like,
I'll take the manual back, actually.
And then I'll burn it in front of you. But I guess I just really appreciate it, and I wanted to echo that sort of that idea that we have to, that part of the beauty of talking to someone like you or I is like, we can help process those things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we can help be like, yeah, that's totally normal. Like you're not
Yeah, that's right.
crazy, or, you're angry because of this, like
Mm-hmm.
not that we tell people what's what, we help that processing. But I just think it's so important to recognize that we don't always know what's going on with us. You and I don't always know what's going
That's
on with
right.
us,
That's right.
right? That's why it's important for us to talk to people as well,
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I just wanted to go on a tangent about that.
I love that because that leads me to my favorite part of therapy. You can strip away all of the philosophy, strip away all of the theories, but therapy is about two people getting together. That's it. One may have gone to school with it, but they're not an expert in your life.
Right.
So it's collaboration, and that's the therapeutic relationship is my favorite part of how this works.
Mm-hmm.
And really, it's summed up with exactly what you just said. It's that space to figure it out, but also to say things like, "Yeah, of course you're pissed off." Full stop. Period. So
Yeah,
thanks for the session today. Of course you're mad.
or when somebody says like, what do you think about this, and you say, I don't know. Like, what do you think? Like I'm not the expert on your life, like just as you said, like
Mm-hmm.
you tell me what you think, and then I can tell you what I think.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to. That's what I love about this kind of sort of collaborative therapy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or therapeutic process, because I'm not technically a therapist. I'm a sociologist. So the therapeutic process where it's just sort of like, yeah, let's figure this out, like let's
Mm-hmm.
walk down that path together, and let's try to figure it out, because what else is there to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what else is life about,
Yeah, it's a human experiment.
Yeah, agreed.
Nobody knows what they're doing. I
No,
remember when turning 20 and realizing my parents didn't know what they were doing, and I was like,
totally.
oh, so we're supposed to go through life having no sweet clue. Awesome.
Amazing. It's like my one of my mentors and counselors, one of our first sessions, she said to me, listen, you're born, you have trauma, you die.
Oh my
It's like my favorite thing. That's what I'll get tattooed on my forehead, right? Like it's amazing. It's like, yeah, good point.
god. Yeah, the human experience is a wild one.
It is.
One thing I always say, and this is definitely from my background, but you are the only you that's ever existed. So no one can give you a manual on how to live it. But there's also like an intense amount of power in that. And it's beautiful to watch that power get cultivated. And it's heartbreaking to watch that power get stifled or crushed. Especially when and this is most of the time, it's not that individual's fault that it got stifled or crushed. They walked into it and it has nothing to do with them. And now they have to deal with it. And that's incredibly powerful.
It's beautiful. And I think that's where we should end.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for your incredible insight.
Thank you so much for inviting me.